Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the paradox of education. Um, Education is a paradox because it simultaneously empowers us by providing us with new information that allows us to change our perspective and ask questions about the world around us. But because education is created in a social framework, it also holds us back because it has certain expectations of us and expects people to fit into a certain mold that is not necessarily a mold that everyone can be successful in. So, for example, in schools today, students are often are told that in order to be successful, they have to get good grades and pass certain tests and take certain extracurriculars. And this can inhibit creativity because a lot of classes are taught to the test and don't allow students to ask questions. And also, society tends to dislike people who ask questions and challenge the society because that usually ensues in some sort of change, and society does not like to change because change is difficult and it's easier and often results in certain people losing their positions of power. So in The Invisible Man, the narrator is a very good example of a young boy who has been sucked into this system of education, and he believes that an education is the only way for him to be successful, especially as a young black man living in a very racist society. But he soon learns that the education he's receiving is only serving to perpetuate the white supremacy that exists in his society, because it teaches him to be submissive to white men and to rely on them for any sort of power or place in the world. An example of this is in the first chapter of the book when he's giving a speech about social responsibility and how blacks must have humility and patience when it comes to earning any sort of freedom. This is a reference to Booker T. Washington, who the author of The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, was very critical of, because Ellison believed that Washington's ideals only perpetuated racism because black people were told not to demand change, but rather to wait for it, and it's difficult for change to happen if it's not being demanded. But in this speech, the narrator is talking to a group of white men, and they praise him for the things that he is saying because they like that he's submissive, and they like that they are going to be able to maintain their position of power. The narrator, they give him a scholarship, which is interesting because it seems like giving someone a scholarship means that they'll have access to an education where they might be able to make a change or make a difference in the world, but they're giving him this scholarship because they know that if he's educated, he will remain submissive to them, and they want to reward that behavior. And this, in that same chapter, the narrator has a dream where his grandpa talks about white control over society and says that white men like to keep this nigger boy running, which illustrates kind of everything that happened during the narrator's speech. The white men are kind of just like running him around and playing him like a puppet, basically. And during the speech, he also accidentally says social equality instead of responsibility, and the white men get nervous and start asking him what he means. And this just shows how difficult it is for people to challenge society without, especially those who have power in society, without society fighting back and turning against them. And this whole incident kind of foreshadows what happens to the narrator later when he's kicked out of his college. He gets kicked out because he challenges the standard of education and challenges the leader, Dr. Bledsoe, who is a black man that used to really believe in education, but after dealing with racism and other horrible things, he's become very cynical and uses his position of power just for himself instead of to help his people. And so when the narrator comes in and challenges everything that he's worked for, he kicks the narrator out. And this shouldn't be how education is, because education, the purpose of it is to give people new knowledge and create progression and innovation in the world. And by kicking out the narrator, Dr. Bledsoe lowered his chances of him making a place for himself in the world, because education often holds a lot of opportunities for people. And in today's society, a lot of people get in trouble at school for doing things that are against the rules, or maybe they don't have the best grades, and they are told that they won't be successful, and so oftentimes they aren't successful. And it can be tied into the school to prison pipeline, in which students who get in trouble for breaking the rules or who are suspended often are more likely to end up in prison than those who follow the rules. And it's not necessarily because, it's definitely not because they're bad people, it's just because they don't fit the certain mold that is expected of them. An example in The Invisible Man of someone who's like this is the vet who the narrator meets at the Golden Day. He's basically been institutionalized and called crazy because he goes against the status quo. He says on page 95 to the narrator, "He believes in you as he believes in the beat of his heart. He believes in that great false wisdom taught slaves and pragmatists alike, that white is right." And so here he challenges their narrator for his reliance on white men. And the narrator really doesn't like this, which shows how resistant to change people are, because it forces them to reflect on their core beliefs. So an example of this in an earlier time period would be slavery. The South was very resistant to give up slavery because they had relied on it so long for their economy and for their work. And so, even though slavery was really a horrible thing, they didn't want to get rid of it because that meant that they would have to rework everything. And that's kind of the case in this book, and it's very prevalent in this book because Black people are trying to get equal rights and are trying to make a place for themselves in this world. Because they're prevented from doing that, a lot of them become very bitter and start becoming the stereotype that white men have of them, because they fight back and lash out and maybe become criminals because their society cannot accept them. Another problem with education is that a lot of the information that we're provided with is very manipulated and biased. History books are often written by the winners and fail to detail the horrible things that might have happened, that the winners might have had to do in order to win. So an example of this in The Invisible Man is during the chapter 5 when Dr. Bledsoe uses Reverend Barbie to talk about how great the school is and how it was founded on all of these wonderful principles, when truthfully the school is very kind of twisted, and its message has been sort of destroyed by Bledsoe. And also this connects to 1984, because everything in that society is censored, and Winston, the narrator of 1984, his job is to censor information, and a quote from 1984 is, "But actually he thought, as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's figures, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense for the other." So this just shows how when people with a lot of power are in charge, they also have the power to manipulate information, which makes it hard for us, like students, to be able to see everything for the way it is, and for us to make our own conclusions based on the knowledge that we're provided, because conclusions have already been made for us. And this just is a further example of why education kind of fails to do its job, because there are so many standards and social norms that we have to fill in order to use our education to be successful.